there is at least one positive reason why I don't believe in God and two negative reasons. The positive reason is the one that was reputed to have been uttered by Laplace when the Emperor Napoleon asked him where God figured in his account of the cosmos. And Laplace famously replied, "I had no need of that hypothesis." In other words, to Laplace, the universe was sufficiently explicable without positing a God, or at least no more explicable if we do posit one. So why do so? We do not need to believe in God in order to explain the universe, and belief in God does not really help us to explain it. Why do people believe in God? Well, I'm asking that as a philosophical question rather than a psychological question. There may be some psychological needs for people to believe in God, but looking at that as more as a philosophical question, we could say that in the Christian tradition, particularly in medieval times, the tradition attempted to develop rational arguments for the existence of God. And to some extent that still exists among Roman Catholic circles. I'll mention three of those famous arguments. There's the first cause argument, that you need to believe in God to answer the question, what caused the universe to exist? And the answer is, of course, God created it. As John says he believes. We're talking about the biblical God, the God who is supposed to have created the world. Secondly, the ontological argument, which works from the definition of God as a being with all the perfections. And thirdly, the argument from design, that the world shows signs of having been designed by a God. Let me briefly look at these. The first cause argument is sometimes today resurrected as something that is compatible with science, because people sometimes say, haven't we learned through science that the universe began with a big bang, that it began around 13 billion years ago? John, I think, said that it was created from nothing, or he quoted a scientist saying it was created from nothing. And how could that happen? How can you create something from nothing? Doesn't that suggest that there has to be a God? But I think scientists are guilty of sowing a great deal of confusion when they use the word universe in statements such as, the universe began 13 billion years ago with the Big Bang. If you actually tackle a physicist who studies this issue and ask, what do you really mean by the universe in that statement? They will tell you, if they're honest, that what they're talking about is the observable universe, or the known universe. The universe that we can observe with our telescopes and all the devices we have seems to have begun from some kind of bang, if you like, development about 13 billion years ago, and to have been expanding ever since. But if you ask the scientist, well, do we know that it began from nothing? They will answer, no, we don't know that at all. We can't observe anything before the Big Bang. So any statements about what the situation was before the Big Bang are not scientific statements. They are statements perhaps of religious faith or belief. So it may well be that the universe, for example, has been constantly oscillating, been constantly expanding and then collapsing and then expanding again, and it's been doing that forever, for infinite time. That's perfectly compatible with everything that science can tell us. So we don't need a God to explain the beginning of the universe. The universe may have always existed. And indeed, if we think that, as the first cause argument runs, everything has to have a first cause, then of course that argument applies to God as well. If we're allowed to say God needs no first cause, then we ought to be allowed to say the universe needs no first cause.
Well, it's not that we recognize each other as equally human, it's that we recognize as equally capable of suffering. And that's why the boundary of our species shouldn't be the boundary of moral concern. Now, in your remarks about the fact that gorillas don't follow these principles, you're confusing the issue of who is a moral agent and who is a subject of moral concern. might say a moral patient. Of course, you have to have a certain level of cognitive capacity or rationality to be a moral agent. And that's why a human child of a year old is not a moral agent, and a human with severe brain damage may not be a moral agent either. But they are still moral patients. That is, it still matters how we treat them because they're capable of suffering. It's in the capacity to suffer that I believe that we're equal. And if you ask what's the moral foundation of that, it's what I said before in talking about Jefferson. It's our capacity to put ourselves in the position of those beings and to say, how would I like it if I were like them? And answer, I wouldn't. And that, incidentally, is not specifically a Christian. You've recognized the golden rule, of course, but that's not specifically a Christian, nor even a Judeo-Christian precept, but one that you find in many other cultures. In fact, I would say in every culture with a developed ethical tradition.
I think at their foundation, all religious belief is irrational insofar as it believes in a deity or a supernatural force or something of that sort. But I put it that way because it depends a lot what you call a religion. For example, Buddhism is often regarded as a religion, but at least in its purer forms, it doesn't presuppose the existence of a deity. I think Buddhism is an interesting example where if you look at the practice of Buddhists in many countries, they become superstitious and they appear to believe that putting prayers somewhere or lighting a candle or something or other is going to somehow affect something that they're hoping for or make things go well. But I think in purer forms of Buddhism that isn't true. So you could say that Buddhism is perhaps a philosophical, ethical way of life rather than a religion. And if you take that out of the religious teaching and other things like Buddhism, then I would say that all of those religions are ultimately irrational. Now, some may be more irrational than others. Some may have stranger and weirder and more bizarre beliefs than others, undoubtedly. But I think that given, and I should say also, given what we know about the world now, I mean, I don't think it was necessarily irrational for people to have religious beliefs before we could explain things. I mean, if you were living in earlier times and you saw thunder and lightning, maybe it wasn't irrational to think, wow, there's some great big guy up there who's angry and is, making this noise and these flashes. But, now we understand what thunder and lightning is, and we have no reason to believe that that is in some way a sign of a god. So I think it depends on our circumstances. But given the kind of knowledge of the world we have today, I think belief in a deity, particularly a deity of the Bible, that sort, is irrational. At least the theist can console the sufferer and say, well, this life is not the only thing that there is, and give them hope of eternal life after death and so on. That this is perhaps, again, an explanation for the prevalence of religion. An explanation because it offers us comfort in a universe that does perhaps appear to many people to be bleak, especially if you've been brought up with the belief that the universe has some kind of overarching purpose and we're going to live eternally and so on. It can seem bleak to say, no, there really is no overarching purpose to it. It just exists, and we are mortal. We're going to be on this earth for 10 or 20 or 50 or 70 or 80 or, if we're very lucky, 100 years. But that's really going to be it. That's all there is. After that, the body dies and consciousness does not survive. I can easily understand why people find it consoling to believe that that is not true. But that should not be a reason for you to believe it to be true. We can't just shape the universe in accordance with our wishes and desires. We can tell ourselves all sorts of fairy stories in that way. I think we have to look at the universe as it is. And although it may appear bleak, I think it's still a fascinating place, a place in which we can have our own purposes. There's no, as I said, no overarching purpose to its creation, but we can still feel we are here in the universe. There are many things we can do. Things, of course, we can do things that we enjoy, but we can also find purpose in trying to reduce the amount of suffering that exists in the world, which, as I've said, both atheists and Christians do. And we can feel that if we have, by the time we die, by the time we reach the end of however many years it is, we have left the world a somewhat better place than it would have been if we'd not lived, then at least perhaps we can die with some sense of fulfillment and satisfaction because we have done that. And for me, I have to say, that's enough, and that's all that I can believe in.